Afternoon, everybody. What? No. Everybody settle down. Hi. Um, One more thing I have to mention, okay? Yesterday's YouTube live stream, it went very well, but
I request the audience to please be quiet and respect the speaker. Hello. Okay. Hi everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Priyanka and my partner is Shreya.
So I'm standing here in front of you people to argue that national security is a justified reason for war. So about this, let me start by defining what exactly is national security. So, national security is the foundation of our stability and prosperity. This includes not just only physically defending our borders, but also protecting our core values, freedoms, and the well being of our people. Now, in our world filled with evolving threats and complex challenges, protecting our country and its people is an important responsibility that cannot be taken lightly at best. In a global environment where hostile forces may seek to understand our way of life, we must be prepared to respond with decisive action when all peaceful options have been exhausted. Thank you.
Now the opposition can please present their statement at the podium.
Good afternoon, everyone. We are Team Insolitus. I am Tanushri, and today we are opposition to the topic, National Security is a Justifiable Reason for War. Before we delve deeper into the subject, I'd like to talk about what war is and why do countries make a decision to start war. War is an intense armed conflict generally caused by a conflict of interest, ambiguity over land, national security, and other disputes. Despite the inhuman suffering caused by war, world leaders still think ending conflicts is easier than waging wars. Wars are illogical. They have countless consequences for everyone, and the assumption that wars end easily is quite wrong. We can take the recent example of the Russian war on Ukraine. Vladimir Putin believed that Ukraine will yield to them and victory would come quick and easy. However, Russia miscalculated and underestimated Ukraine's resolve, and it cost them millions in equipment and, importantly, unnecessary lives of innocent civilians. Thank you.
Thank you to both teams for presenting their opening statements. Can the proposition please come up and present their main statement?
The war on terror was one of the most critical national security efforts in the entire American history. Ladies and gentlemen, there are many different reasons why a country might go into a war. Some of these reasons are more justifiable than others. For example, a war of aggression in which a country attacks another country with no good reason is never justified. However, a war of self-defense in which a country fights back against an imminent attack is always justified. The national security is a broad term that encompasses many different things. It includes the protection of a country's border, its people, its resources, and its way of life. When any of these one factors are attacked, then the country will have to face a lot of after effects to deal with. This threatens the country's national security. When this happens, a country has every right to take an action to defend itself. There are people who strongly abide by this. National security is a first duty of any government. This is actually a quote said by Theresa May, an ex-president who served for 3 years from 2016 to 2019 for the United Kingdom. There are many examples for war that were justified by the national security reasons. Another example is the 2001 war in Afghanistan. The Taliban regime in Afghanistan was harboring Al-Qaeda, the terrorist group responsible for the 9/11 attacks. The United States went to war against Afghanistan to remove the Taliban from the power and prevent them using Afghanistan as a base for terrorism. Here, America has tried to save women, kids, and all the elder people and help them maintain their rights. The Russia-Ukrainian war. From the Moscow's perspective, NATO's encroachment on former Soviet states, including the Baltic states and the Eastern Europe, has encircled Russia and disrupted its traditional sphere of influence. This has perceived the encirclement This perceived encirclement has led Russia to compromise. While NATO claims to promote stability and security, it is essential to recognize the Russia's response, including the Russo-Ukraine conflict and the increase in military activity near the NATO's borders. The third example is the war of terror, that officially the global war of terrorism and global counterterrorism military campaign initiated by the United States following the 9/11 attacks. The global war of terror initiated the response to the 9/11 attacks remains crucial and justifiable effort to safeguard the national security. The terrorism poses a significant threat to the countries worldwide and transcending borders and affecting the lives of countless innocent civilians. And the list is never ending. These are just three popular examples of the wars that were justified by the national security concerns. There are many more examples throughout the history. Of course, there is no war without its cost. A war is always a tragedy, and it should always be a last resort. However, when the country's national security is threatened, it has every right to take action to defend itself. I believe that the national security is a justified reason for war. When a country's survival is at stake, it has the right to fight back. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Now the opposition may please present their main speech.
Hello everyone, this is Shreya. National security is not a justifiable reason of war in the light of the following reasons. Humanitarian consequences. Owing to the subsequent factors, there are other alternatives for war that can be explored. And also, we shouldn't forget the inaccurate pretext for waging a war. And also, the erosion of civil liberty rights at home that takes place due to waging a war. Not to mention the long-term consequences, the economic cost of the country, and preventive war fallacy, and moral and ethical considerations, most importantly. All the topics that we will be exploring in the next 5 minutes. Humanitarian consequences. Innocent people are frequently killed during a war, and civilians may suffer disproportionately when a national security is used as a pretext for war. For example, Iraq War of 2003 was due to the assertion that Saddam Hussein has possessed WMDs, which are weapons of mass destruction, and it was based on the falsehood of the two Iraqi spies, Ahmad Rafid and Ahmad Chalabi. But even before the war waged, intelligence from highly paced sources was available suggesting that Saddam Hussein did in fact not possess any type of weaponry for mass destruction, which means that the country's main motive was not national security, but in fact it had hidden motives. Alternatives for war. Diplomacy and conflict resolution, enhancing intelligence, promoting economic development and stability, strengthening the homeland security, also addressing the climate change, building alliances, improving healthcare, fostering cyber security, most importantly, are some of the other ways that can be explored instead of waging a war. For example, to cite a case, Iran nuclear deal of 2015, which was not so long ago. According to this, Iran was seen as a potential threat for USA, but and other countries, a point to be noted, but instead of waging a war, USA agreed to make a peace treaty deal with Iran, and by diplomacy and conflict resolution, Iran agreed to limit its nuclear powers to use only for nuclear energy and not for nuclear weaponry. Similar to that is Plan Colombian initiative. In the late 1990s and 2000s, Colombia was dealing with a complicated security situation. But instead of waging a war, USA and other countries provided funds and economic development projects, social programs, and other security measures for Colombia. Colombia was dealing with a complicated security situation in which the yeah, in which drug cartels, drug usage was very prominent, and Marxist guerrilla groups like the FARC was very prominent, which added to the bloodshed and instability. Another point to be noted is inaccurate pretext of waging a war. In the past, governments have utilized national security as a pretext to gain power and acquire resources. Example, Gulf of Tonkin incident, Vietnam War. According to the US, Vietnamese boat had attacked US Navy ships, but the cruel twist was that there was no proven evidence for the attack, but this resulted in the US invading Gulf of Tonkin, and also further leading to the US involvement in the Vietnam War. We should also talk about the erosion of civil liberty. National security often lead to the erosion of civil liberties at home. USA Patriot Act, for example, it extends terrorism laws to include domestic terrorism, which could subject political organizations to surveillance, wiretapping, harassment, criminal action for political advocacy, which violates the 1st, 5th, 6th, and not to mention the 14th Amendments of Acts. Also, it allows FBI agents to investigate American citizens for criminal matters without probable cause of crime, even if they say it for intelligence purposes, which threatens the 4th Amendment of Act. Tanushree will take over.
I'm so sorry, but your time's over. This concludes the main speech round. You now have 5 minutes to consult with your mentors and to conduct research before the rebuttals begin. Then your first rebuttal. In the form of a question.
Since you guys talked about Russia and Ukraine's war, don't you think Russia's reaction to the NATO was totally geopolitical? Was there really an actual reason, national security reason to start the war?
Proposition, please provide your answer. Also, slight note, you're referring to each other. Please do not say you. Please refer to each other as the proposition or the opposition.
Okay. So the NATO is actually the Northern Atlantic Treaty for the Treaty Organization. The founding members of this organization were Belgium, Canada, Denmark, United Kingdom, USA, and it started in 1949. And neither of them had any geopolitical connection with Russia. Please make a point of that. And following which, they politically and economically influenced the countries nearby them. And it started spreading like a virus. Following which, in 1952, there was Greece, Turkey. And in 1955, there was West Germany who joined them. In 1982, the Spain joined during the Cold War. And following it, and there were other countries that were having geopolitical connections with Russia, like Croatia, Northern Macedonia and all. So this is completely not geopolitical, but rather it was something that was pre-planned, I would rather say. It was something that was actually, the main motive was to get Soviet Union back into the picture.
Opposition, would you like to have a follow-up question?
Since the proposition talked about how Russia was actually getting pressurized because the NATO was surrounding Russia, I would like to ask, why would the proposition wage war? Why should it be in the form of violence? Can't the proposition have a sort of alliance or a discussion with more third parties from different countries and create a sort of decision instead of starting the war one-sidedly on Ukraine?
Proposition, please present your answer.
So I completely agree with the point what opposition has come up with. But then, however, Russia did try multiple times to negotiate with the NATO. But then the drastic movement of NATO towards the Russia was unexplainable by them, and also the way they forced the other countries to join them was also really doubtful, and we couldn't actually come to the conclusion that so it is not explainable that we could actually negotiate it, because it rather felt forceful and it sounded like it is unnegotiable actually. So we tried Russia has tried negotiating with them, but then it never worked out. The last consequence that Russia has chosen was this, because in around 1999, there was this treaty signed by Ukraine called the Budapest Treaty, and this was a treaty that mentioned that the Ukraine will give all of its military resources to Russia, and and Russia in return would support would support Ukraine and protect them overall. So, but then the first one to break this was Ukraine, and Ukraine joined hands with NATO, and that was and the reason was the president of during that time was actually a supporter of NATO. So the reason for this was more forceful rather than so the reason was more forceful than something that could be negotiated.
Would the opposition like to present a final follow-up question?
Since the proposition mentioned that the Russia was negotiating with Ukraine, doesn't the proposition think that the negotiating was not done properly and has actually caused them a lot of impatience to start war? Because Russia and Ukraine are two separate countries, and Ukraine has the right to do what they think is right for them. And Russia doesn't really have a opinion, and they can, but it shouldn't be very violent, right? So it should be more in the terms of dealing or in alliance rather than forcing themselves.
Can you phrase that as a question?
Um,
If you want to leave it as a statement, we can move ahead.
you can move it.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay. So since that was not a question, we will be moving on to the proposition's first rebuttal. Please come to the podium and ask your question.
So there is this famous incident that has occurred in Iran. So there was this Iran's nuclear plant, which was actually in which the Israeli people have invaded in the name of peace treaty, but then they stole the important documents and they were not ready to negotiate. So that was actually the reason for the Iranian and Israeli war. So do you think, does the opposition think that isn't it good enough a reason that the Irani people were Irani government was actually being justifiable to raise a war against Israel?
Opposition, please present your answer.
I still think that there are other peaceful means that can be explored. However, the threat was, however the strong the threat was. For example, we can explore other means by diplomacy and conflict resolution, and not to state that the restrictions that the I'm sorry, a minute, please. Yeah, so the diplomacy thing can be made even more flexible and not so violent, basically. Yeah, I think I'm going to conclude with that.
Would the proposition like to ask a follow-up question?
So I would rather make it clear for the opposition team that Iran is actually a government rather than it being a monarch government. It is more like a democratic government. It has its own people in positions that can actually decide what is right and what is wrong. So I would like to ask a question. Do you think the opposition think that Iranian government hasn't tried to negotiate? Don't you think that has failed? Because the first thing is that the Israeli people have stolen the important documents that could be used against the Irani people, and it would actually affect the people, the economy, and the resources and the way of life. There was a chance for the Iranian people, Iran to lose its population, and Iran could lose the government itself. Like the entire country could have been wiped out.
Opposition, please present your answer.
Persistence and patience are often required for diplomacy methods. So I don't think Iran had actually did the diplomatic measures in the proper way. It requires a lot of persistence and patience for over years to negotiate a deal, and also without imposing strict deadlines and flexibility, a country can definitely negotiate a peace treaty without actually waging a war, which can kill millions of people, and it can take a lot of time for the country to recover. So do you actually think that war is the right reason in this case?
Would the proposition like to present one final follow-up question?
Everybody knows this 2001 war of Afghanistan. The Taliban regime in the Afghanistan was harboring Al-Qaeda, the terrorist group. So the United States has taken this into the hand because the Taliban has taken Afghanistan as its base, and that could actually cause terrorism across the world. It can go anywhere, and the government didn't have any power, military power, to actually stop them. And the only thing that the government could do was take help of United States, and that is how. And there was a problem with Taliban people taking up. Not only was that there was a lot of terrorism, there was also they were actually controlling women. There was a loss of rights of women and kids. So don't you think that it is actually justifiable when the United States went against the Afghanistan just to remove the terrorism present in the Afghanistan that actually is destroying the country itself and also the countries around it?
Can the opposition please present their answer?
As I said before, I don't think the negotiations were dealt in a proper way. First of all, Taliban, which is already a fragile nation, by waging a war, USA made it even more unstable. And also, this conflict was prolonged for 20 years, which means that for 20 years there was no economic development, security in the country. Also, there were geopolitical reasons. It strained the relationship with Pakistan and Russia, its neighboring countries. And also, it did not eliminate the threat of terrorism. In fact, new threats were caused in different regions. So, do you still think that waging a war of USA to the Taliban is justified, even after the fact that the country it had no economic development for over 20 years?
With that, we're going to conclude this line of rebuttal. We're going to start the next round of rebuttals now with the proposition asking the first question.
So the opposition has mentioned that Taliban is a nation, but Taliban is not a nation. But then Taliban is actually a group of people who actually dominated a government of a nation. So that is the first thing. And the second thing is we can't. As the opponents have told, we have tried for 20 years. And it's not just the it's just not one country. It is like multiple countries who have tried negotiating with terrorists. There is no result of having conversations with terrorists because they always want what they want. They don't want to actually have a peace treaty over it. So don't you think that there is no reason for us to actually talk with terrorists who are actually threatening a lot of countries?
Opposition, please respond.
I think the proposition's subsequent argument falls short of even the right of speciousness to say that war is the right ways to deal with this situation. There are many examples when terrorist groups were dealt in a peaceful measures. For example, the Plan Colombia initiative. As I stated earlier in my speech, in the early 1990s and 2000s, Colombia was dealing with a complicated Marxist guerrilla group called FARC. But instead of waging a war, USA made a deal with Colombia, and also it provided funds and sanctions for its economic development, which can be seen as a result. Significant improvements have been made with regards to security measures, economic status, etc. So how can you say that we cannot deal with terrorist groups and we should just wage a war instead of even opting for the other peaceful measures?
Would the proposition like to follow up?
So I would like to make a clarity for the opposition team that the terrorist regimes actually have one motive in their mind. It is not always that they want to actually make peace treaty with the government. It is like if the peace treaty that the government could offer is actually something that they could accept, it is towards them, they are ready to accept, but then it is not always always the time, and sometimes the things that the terrorist wants is not always that is givable by the country itself. And also I would like to tell a situation to the opposition team. There was this situation where Muhammad Gaddafi was actually a terrorist, and he and his terrorist regime has carried Viagra in their pockets, and they actually mass raped women. So I would like to ask you: do you think negotiation still works? There are violent cases that we need to work on, and not, as you mentioned, not terrorists are not people that we could negotiate with. They have too many violent ways that they approach a government and they approach a country and take over the country.
Opposition, please respond.
Since the proposition talked about this mass rape of women, I'd like to say that this. The war waging between the US and Afghanistan was for 20 years, and actually by Joe Biden by 2021 withdrew from this war, and just because just because of war doesn't mean that the Taliban would sit still, right? So as soon as Joe Biden has withdrew from the war, the Taliban overtook Afghanistan, and now many more women suffer now than those women who just got raped. The whole country is now under the hands of Taliban, and not one woman can go out, and it's not safe for them. So my question to the proposition is, if war is the only answer, why is it not showing definite results, right? Why is there always a sort of consequence to war, and why is there not really a proper, definite conclusion to whatever is happening? Because having a war for 20 years is not something small, because you're having so many military people dying, soldiers dying, innocent civilians dying. So if you still think war is the only way you can handle national security, I'd really like to ask another reason why. Sure.
Actually, as a response, you're not supposed to ask them a question.
Okay. Oh.
So we're going to end this line of questioning now, and the opposition can present their next question for this round of rebuttals. Opposition, please present a question.
The opposition proposition mentioned about the gang rape of the women. So I would like to ask the proposition that the fact that after waging a war, millions of people were killed, millions, and not for a day or two, it was for years. Do you still think that the women that have been raped were the major concern for the government? And also, a point to be noted that terrorism can be eliminated by enhancing the intelligence. So yeah, there can be other means that can be opted to eliminate terrorism instead of waging a war which killed millions of people and not just 5 or 6 women.
Proposition, please answer.
So I would like to make a small clarity. The reasons for raging a war of aggression is actually the reason for actually the reasons for actually making a war of self-defense is actually when the country is threatened of its resources, its people, and its economy. So the first thing, the Taliban it was not Taliban, by the way, it's the terrorist regime under Muhammad was actually raping women in a large number. It was like each and every person, if there is any woman on their side, they just go and gang rape. That is how bad it was. So, and the world wouldn't stop. Like, the world wouldn't just watch this situation and just stop and just think that we have a diplomatical way to solve this. And do you think we have tried for 20 years? Name 20 years. We have tried each and every way, each and every method of diplomacy, and still they can't come into the terms. They just want what they want. And do you think there is any other way except than the war against the Taliban regime for the government or the world to do?
Would the opposition like to follow up?
Since the proposition mentioned about this person raping more than 500 people, I have a question. No. So why?
You have to ask them a question. Yes.
Yeah. Why would for one person would you wage a whole war on a whole nation? Is because the nation doesn't have only one person. There are innocent children, there are innocent civilians, and normal workers working there. Like, you can't, the proposition can't put the reason of having one person to start a whole war on one nation because of one person.
Proposition, please respond.
So I would like to make a clarity, and we have never mentioned the word 500, and it is just not one woman, it is just the entire women of the entire nation. And even if, let us take an example that has happened in India. There was a situation in Delhi that has happened, and it is a really big situation. It is called the Nirbhaya case. And when that happened, the entire women in the country have taken it as their thing, and they took it as their own thing, and they fought for it. And the nation has also taken serious charges against this. And it is just not just one woman for the first thing, and the second thing, even if it is a one woman, why should the government just stop and just not fight them? So the second thing is, the Taliban regime just not only just raped women or just violated women's rights and kids' rights. I would like to make a clarity to the opposition that the Taliban have also stopped lot of regular things that happen. There are a lot of men that were actually stopped going to war, and they were given a gun. They were asked to fight against the government, and there were young kids, like 10 or 11. The male kids were actually given guns to fight against the government. And there was this situation of Malala Yousafzai. I hope the opposition knows about it. She was actually going to school, and she was shot on her head. Can you imagine that? Just a 5-year-old girl going to a school, and she was just shot. So I would like to ask a question. Do you still think that Taliban regime is just a small thing, and it doesn't affect the entire nation of the entire economic state and the entire government, the nation itself, that we shouldn't fight on it?
With this, we're going to end this round of rebuttals. The rebuttals are now closed, and we are going to start with the closing statements. Proposition, please present your closing statements.
So to conclude, I would like to restate the important point that national security is definitely a legitimate reason for war, and all other options have been exhausted. Moreover, we must recognize the majestic obligation of all governments to protect their citizens, defend their country, and preserve their way of life. In an interconnected world where threats to our security can come from multiple sources, we must remain alert, prepared, and ready to defend ourselves, even if diplomacy cannot resolve the serious threats that we may face. However, we should also remember the fact that the decision to go to war should never be taken lightly. The impact is profound and will not just affect our generation, but generations to come. It is a moral obligation to seek peaceful alternatives, negotiate and engage in international diplomacy before restoring an armed conflict. After all, all the argument that the national security justifies war is not a glorification of conflict, but an honest recognition of the harsh realities of our world. We hope that through strong diplomacy, cooperation, and global engagement, we can work towards a peaceful world where the war is exception rather than the rule. Thank you.
Thank you. Now the opposition, please present your closing statements.
We would like to conclude and summarize our stance of opposition to national security being justifiable for war. We recommend to use the money spent on war for other ways to preserve national security, such as support international organizations like the United Nations to facilitate peaceful conflict resolution. Funds can be used to support NATO or UN peacekeeping missions, fostering a more stable global environment. Example, the funds spent on military operations in a conflict-prone region could be redirected to support diplomatic initiatives aimed at resolving underlying disputes. Use funds to bolster intelligence capabilities to prevent terrorist attacks, cyber threats, or espionage. Investing in infrastructure, education, and job creation in regions prone to conflict can reduce the roots of causing instability. Example, the Plan Colombia initiative. Redirecting resources to mitigate climate-related conflicts such as water scarcity, disputes, or migration due to environmental changes. And the COVID-19 pandemic demonstrated the importance of a strong healthcare system in preserving national security. We should stop and think before waging war. At the end of the day, violence is never the answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we will open up the floor for audience questions. Only 2 questions.
So basically, I have a question for the opposition. So you stated that war is not justified by national security. But if you were to consider in actuality, many wars are not just done by national security, right? So, sorry, I'll just restate it again. Many wars are given by the national security. And they were done because most of the problems arise because of failed negotiations, and those negotiations were not done just in first 1 year or 2 years. They were done like decades long, but they didn't get any solution for that. What do you propose a solution if you were to be in the same footsteps of the national security?
The point is, national security is often used as a pretext for waging a war, and it's not essentially the actual reason. Many countries have a hidden motive behind waging a war. For example, extracting oils, other resources, and gaining control over it, which has been done for over as long as we can remember. So it's not. So essentially, waging a war is national security is basically not most of the time it's not the actual reason for waging a war. And if you talk about other peaceful ways to negotiate a deal, it could include diplomacy methods, conflict resolution, which is a very important subject in psychology, by the way. And we can enhance intelligence and cyber security, etc. These are the other peaceful ways that can be explored.
Okay, next question. Move on to judge questions.
So my first question is to the proposition. You've talked and debated so much with the opposition about the plight of people under Taliban, and your stance is that war is national security is a good reason for war. Who did these people under the Taliban go to war with? They went to war with the USA, not with the Taliban. Of course, they resisted, but that was never exactly a war, was it? It was guerrilla warfare. It was not war the way it was with the US and between the US and Iran, Iraq, and all these guys. So my question to you is, you've debated so much about this. How is this in the interest of national security? Who is national security? Because these guys were simply thrown towards these US forces that were really strong. And so how is this a defense? How is this national security? The Taliban simply coerced people that were fighting the Taliban to go and die facing US soldiers. That is my question.
I believe that the government of Afghanistan has taken help of United States. I would rather say it was a equal 50-50 situation where the United States gets to weed out terrorism in the world, and at the same time the Afghanistan gets to actually save its people. So the first thing with the terrorism in Afghanistan, the Taliban, is that they actually harmed the people, the nation, the resources. They've used minor kids, just merely 10 to 11. They raped girls that were around age of 6. And I believe that the Afghanistan has taken a good decision rather than letting the people get experience the social embarrassment at the same time. Just imagine living in their shoes. You're scared day to day, each and every day. You're scared that somebody would come in, they kill your family, just take the women away, and just give the kids just guns and ask them to fight against USA. I do get it, but then there is no other way that the Afghanistan could negotiate with the Taliban. The only option was to actually plead the other countries to help them. That is our opinion in this.
And that concludes the debate for today. Thank you to all the participants, thank you to all the audience members, thank you to the judges, and thank you to me.